Before I introduce Kelly McGonigal, our featured speaker tonight, I'd like to introduce you to Monica Hansen, a Compassion Cultivation Training teacher who is going to get us all in the perfect space to hear Kelly by leading us through a short meditation activity. Monica?
So welcome. You might take a moment and look around the room and perhaps see some familiar faces and also some new faces. We're going to engage in a body-based meditation for 5 minutes tonight. And this meditation is inspired by the Compassion Cultivation Training course that's been developed here at Stanford University in the School of Medicine at the Center for Compassion and Altruism, Research and Education. And as you just heard, my name is Monica Hansen, and I'm one of the compassion instructors here at Stanford. I wanted to tell you a little bit about what we're going to do and then why. So the meditation has a movement in it. I'm going to invite you to take one of your hands and bring it to your upper chest near your physical heart. And you'll find a sense of connection with your own body and the warmth of your own physical heart. And then extend that out into the space that's around you. Let's do that 2 times together. Bring your hand to your heart. And then extend, warmth and connection. One more time, hand to heart, warmth and connection. So in the meditation, when you're doing that, there'll be an opportunity to pause, open your eyes and look around again, and contemplate that although there's individual differences, there's different expressions of individuals here, we're each unique individuals, there's also some basic sameness that we experience some of basic sameness in life as well. So that'll be the reflection. I'm going to say 2 more things and then we'll start. The first thing is I picked this particular practice tonight because it embodies the qualities that are bringing together: compassion and altruism, resiliency, and a sense of community. And the second reason is this is an on-the-spot practice. So in a time of need, when you're facing your own suffering or the suffering of another, this practice reliably will pop up and be of benefit. There's something here between the breathing and the moving and the contemplating and the reflecting that will pop up in a time of need and be of benefit. So that's 2 reasons why I picked it. I'm going to say one last thing and then we'll start. The last thing I'd like to say is I've led a lot of guided meditations. And I know that sometimes the guidance in a meditation can feel restrictive, or perhaps it feels oppressive, or it just may not meet your particular need in this moment. And if that's true, what I'd like to invite you to consider doing is taking a broad perspective of this experience and sitting with yourself and your experience in a way that would be meaningful. You can let my voice drop to the background and follow some kind of internal practice that would feel meaningful in this moment. So that's it. Let's begin. Go ahead and sit up a little bit taller. You can imagine the crown of your head reaching up towards the ceiling. And then settle back down. Feel the seat behind you and the seat beneath you. Feel your feet down on the ground. And if you'd like, rub your hands on your pant legs. Have a sense of your hands resting on your legs. Notice that your body is breathing. And in the next 3 breaths, open your eyes and look out into the room or around the room. Have a sense of the physical place that you're inhabiting. Then bring your head back to center, your eyes back to center. So I'm going to keep my eyes open. That's my job. You're welcome to either drop your gaze or close your eyes if that feels comfortable. And then take 3 long inhales and exhales. On your next inhale, bring one hand to your upper chest by your heart. And as you're breathing in, notice where in your body do you feel expansion. And as you're breathing out, notice where do you feel release. Find in your own body a connection to your body and to the heat or the warmth of your own heart. There's a tangible connection and a tangible warmth. Take a long inhale. And as you're exhaling, extend that connection and warmth out into the space around you. Nice. You could move your hand too. Inhaling, bring your hand back to your heart. And then exhale, extend that warmth and connection. Inhale, bring your hand back to your heart. Pause here. And open your eyes again. Look around the room. If you happen to make some eye contact with someone, let there be a soft, receptive gaze. And then close your eyes or drop your gaze. That reflection on common humanity. Even though there's individuals that are here, each one of us have unique experiences. See if this feels true. That we all know what it's like to experience ups and downs in life. That we know what it's like to experience joy and sorrow, birth and death, concerns and celebrations. See if there's some willingness to take a long inhale into the complexity of our shared common humanity. And as you're exhaling, extend that warmth, connection on behalf of common humanity, on behalf of all of us. If you're willing, 2 more times, inhaling and exhaling. And then resting here in the rhythm of your own breath, giving and receiving, sense of warmth, connection. Perhaps it's compassion and kindness. If there's someone specific that comes to mind that you'd like to dedicate this practice to, you're welcome to. Perhaps it's a situation or a community or a global concern. Let's all take one last long inhale and long exhale, extending compassion and kindness out into this space. And starting to close this practice, return to the rhythm of your own breath. Feel your feet resting down on the ground. Feel the chair that's behind you and beneath you. Your hands resting in your lap. You can open and close your eyes a few times, noticing if there's been any shifts or changes. So as I mentioned at the beginning, thank you for engaging in this experiment. This is a practice that's in the Compassion Cultivation Training program. The classes are offered here at Stanford, and they're offered around the world by certified teachers. You can go to CCARE's website and click on the Education tab to find out more. So thank you.
I feel like that is the perfect opening for tonight's gathering. Thank you all for being here. It's my delight to introduce Kelly McGonigal, who in this room actually really needs no introduction because she is a Stanford scholar and one of Stanford's most popular teachers. You may know that Kelly is a health psychologist and a Stanford graduate, and we're so excited to welcome her home tonight to talk about her new book. In addition to being the author of many wonderful books, including the upcoming Upside of Stress, and you can pre-order, by the way. I'm telling you that so Kelly doesn't have to. Kelly is the co-author of Stanford's Compassion Cultivation Training program and one of its master instructors. She was in the instructor cohort for the very first class that was offered, and she's been a very important figure in Stanford's Compassion and Altruism Research Center from the very beginning. Kelly is an incredibly generous colleague, and I had the great fortune for her to interview me for this book that is coming out now, and I think I had way more fun than she did during that interview, and she sent out a really glorious tweet after the interview about how much fun it had been to talk to another compassion researcher. So I want to thank her for being such a generous and inspiring colleague. And I want to tell you my favorite memory of Kelly, which is beyond all of her credentials and her training. I had the pleasure of sitting in her Stanford Continuing Studies class called Stress 2.0, which she was teaching as she developed this book. And every single class period, I stood in line at the front of the stairs. We were in the history corner. And there would be such a long line that the whole 15-minute break would go by, and I never made it to the front. And then after class, I would get back in the line, and it would be so long that I would have to go home, and I never made it to the front. So I went through the whole class, waiting in line every single class period to talk to Kelly, and I never actually got to talk to her, which I think is a testament to the fact that she has what journalists would call a nose for a good story. So how in the world can you imagine teaching a class on stress where every single class period you generate lines and lines of students that can't wait to talk to you? She's an incredible teacher, and part of her incredible teaching and her capacity to connect with audiences is that she can make even the most dry, dull, boring piece of social psychology sing. Right? She just knows how to find the nugget and bring it alive. So I am so grateful that she's here tonight. Please welcome Kelly McGonigal.
Thank you. I'm so glad we finally got to talk after all of that. So thank you, Monica, for leading that meditation. One of the things that I have found from doing a meditation like that is you feel the connection, you feel the warmth, and then you want to do something caring, right? Right? Can I interest you in doing something caring? So one of my very good friends, Sarah Ramirez, is here. Where is she? Where'd you go, Sarah? Oh, you moved to the back. It's her birthday. And I forgot to say happy birthday when I saw her this morning. And I thought, you know, we're so full of compassion and caring, and she is one of the most compassionate and altruistic people I know. So who better to sing her happy birthday than the Center for Compassion and Altruism in honor of her great compassion and altruism? Can we sing to her? Yes, okay. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Sarah. Happy birthday to you. Yay. Thank you for being here. So we've meditated, we've sung. It is time for some stories and some science. And this is another friend of mine, Natalie Stavas. And this picture was taken a year ago in April in Boston, just about to run a race. And a year before that, in Boston, Natalie was running a very different race. She was running the Boston Marathon, and she had just finished the 26th mile, and she could see the finish line in her sight. And she actually had just run all 26 miles on a broken foot, which is kind of incredible. But she insisted on running the race because she was raising money for a children's hospital, and she didn't want to let them down. So this was April 15th, 2013, and just as she was about to reach the finish line, she heard what she thought were fireworks, right? And of course, why not? Fireworks were finishing the most amazing race in the world. And then she saw a horde of people running in the wrong direction. And she realized that something was terribly wrong. And in that moment, there are a couple of different instincts that could arise. And one possible instinct is the instinct to run like hell and save yourself. And the instinct she had instead was to try to figure out what had gone wrong and if she could help. And in fact, she actually jumped over a race barricade, she ran down an alley, and she found herself outside the Atlantic Fish Company, which was the scene of the second explosion. And there were bodies there. And she immediately went to work doing CPR and first aid. And she ended up treating 5 people that day, and 4 of them survived. And cops had to drag her away from the scene of the explosion in order to make her stop. And Natalie is an amazing human being. But she's not the only person who in that moment had that instinct to help rather than to run. Although some people who helped actually ran from the marathon to donate blood, which is kind of amazing. But lots of people, their first instinct was to see if there was something they could do to help. For example, some of you may remember this sort of thing that popped up that day. People online who didn't know what else to do, and there was this new phenomenon called crowd caring instead of crowd sharing, where people were creating these Google documents and trying to see, what can I do to help? Is anyone stranded? Do you need a place to stay? Do you need someone to talk to you? Do you need a beer? We're here for you. And there were other people who went back to the finish line and collected the belongings and the race medals to try to reunite them with people who had been terrified and had fled. And I've been thinking a lot about Natalie in that day because, as many of you know, the trial is going on now for the Boston Marathon bombing. And I've been thinking about both how important it was that day, if you remember the horror, how important it was that day to hear all of these stories of caring and altruism and helping, to have the balance to what was such a horrific day. And as I think about it, it's not that that day was actually that unique, that whenever there's a tragedy or trauma, one that's quite personal or small, or one that is global, that these difficult circumstances often give rise to acts of kindness and acts of courage. And that's what I'm going to talk with you about today, the science of that instinct, the instinct when we're under stress or people are suffering, and instead of just trying to protect ourselves and our own resources, there's this powerful instinct in human nature to help and to care, an instinct of compassion and altruism. And so I want to talk a little bit about why it is we have that instinct, to appreciate it from a scientific point of view, a biological point of view. And also, really importantly, the benefits of nourishing and cherishing that instinct, of actually making it a conscious choice for our own well-being and to help support resilience in others. So we can start with the researcher who first coined this term, the Tend-and-befriend instinct. This is Shelley Taylor. She's a psychologist at UCLA. And about 15 years ago, she was having a conversation with a postdoc in her lab, and they were talking about how even though the science of stress says that stress makes you aggressive, it makes you selfish, it makes you isolate yourself, that in their experience, stress often made them more caring and more pro-social. That under stress, they wanted to connect with others. That under stress, they actually felt really good when they were able to help others. And they felt like this side of stress wasn't really being fully documented and talked about in the world of science. And so she and her colleagues set about demonstrating and documenting how in all social species, humans and non-humans, we have these really powerful social instincts under stress. For example, the instinct to literally cling to one another, both when we need support and also the instinct to offer support when we see others suffering. Also, the instinct that we have to defend those who are vulnerable, to protect them, whether it's a mama taking care of baby or when we feel compelled to stand up for what we believe in. And again, we see these in all social species, in animals and humans. And also the instinct and capacity we have to coordinate, to share resources, right? This is very intelligent cooperation going on here. And of course, we see this ourselves, that often we actually take great pleasure in being able to share resources with people who need it, rather than hoard those resources. And this isn't the only instinct that's part of human nature, right? That we also have the instinct sometimes to be selfish, or to be aggressive and hostile, or to isolate ourselves when we're suffering. But Shelley Taylor and her colleagues began to really draw attention to the fact that that's not the only side of human nature, that we are in some way born or hardwired to connect during difficult times, whether it's our own stress or whether it's the observation that someone else is struggling. And so we know a little bit about the biology of this instinct. And I always think it's nice to know a little bit about the biological side, because it helps me think about what's happening to me when I have this kind of experience. And so we know that a big part of the basis for the tend-and-befriend instinct is a neurohormone called oxytocin, which a lot of people know about because it's gotten really good PR. You sometimes hear it referred to as the cuddle hormone, the hug hormone, the love hormone, because it tends to increase when you're in loving contact or supportive contact with someone else, like when a mom is nursing her baby or when a friend gives you a hug. And in fact, it has such good PR that you can actually buy it and snort it. I don't know if you've seen this. You can buy nasal inhalers with oxytocin. But of course, you don't need to do this because it's built into our natural stress response, right? That your pituitary gland releases oxytocin during times of stress. And when it does that, it really fine-tunes some of your social instincts. So when you have a stress response and oxytocin levels rise, it tends to increase your empathy for people that you care about. It increases your willingness to help people. It increases your ability to read other people's facial expressions so that you have that kind of instinctive empathy for what other people are feeling and what they might need. And it also has an interesting side effect. So while it's helping us connect with others, oxytocin also seems to make us brave. When we have higher levels of oxytocin, it actually dampens down the fear circuitry of the brain. And if you actually want to make someone become more confident and more courageous, one of the best ways to do it is make them feel more connected. So when we have a stress response, either to our own suffering or when we're aware of the suffering of others, this is all part of the biology of what might be happening. And so we may find ourselves wanting to reach out and get a hug from a friend or talk to someone about our problem, but we may also find ourselves more willing to reach out to help someone else. And because courage is part of the biochemistry of this tend-and-befriend response, we actually find that we have the energy and the willingness to do things that are difficult, to things that might scare us, where we're willing to step forward and stay close to suffering, even when we also have that instinct to run and protect ourselves or to escape that pain. And so there's something very interesting about this neurohormone that doesn't just make us want to cuddle, but also makes us brave. The interesting thing about a tend-and-befriend response is that you can actually create this biology by choosing to have a social response to stress, whether it's your own stress or when you're aware that someone else is struggling. And so I want to tell you about a study that was done where they actually asked women to come into the laboratory and to bring a loved one. So if you're a woman, you can imagine yourself showing up. If you have a woman who's a loved one, I want you to imagine that you're the loved one. The women actually, I think, maybe have the better part in this study. So the woman shows up with her loved one and finds out that her loved one is going to be receiving a series of painful electrical shocks. You're like, thanks for bringing me to this study. And just to make sure you understand how painful these are, you get an electrical shock yourself, right? So you're like, okay, that definitely hurts. And then your loved one, as they're going to be receiving this pain, you were told that during some of these shocks, you are going to be able to hold their hand. You can squeeze their hand. And in those moments, you can think about that as an act of support, right? That you can support them in this moment of pain. During other shocks, you're not going to hold your loved one's hand. Instead, you're going to get a stress ball. And you are able to squeeze the stress. And you can channel your stress about your loved one's suffering, right? By really trying to reduce your own stress and manage your own stress. The researchers were interested in what these two different kind of stress reduction strategies would do for women. and how it might affect even what's going on in their brains. Like, what was actually more effective at making them feel less stressed out about the suffering of their loved one? And so indeed, they looked at what was happening in the brains of the women as they either squeezed the stress ball or held their loved one's hands and thought about supporting it. And one of the most interesting findings is that when women were holding their loved one's hands, you saw increased activation in the brain's reward system, which is an area of the brain that basically seems to be built to make us want to approach and take action. And it creates a sense that something good is going to happen if we approach or if we act. And in some ways, this is sort of underlying the experience we have of hope. So when women were focused on holding their loved one's hand and providing support, it created this chemistry of hope in the brain. When they were squeezing the stress ball, did not do that at all. And when they felt that increase in hope and connectedness, and the brain's reward system became more activated, there was a corresponding decrease in activity in the amygdala, which many of you have probably heard of as the stress center of the brain, and it's particularly reactive when we are afraid. And so the fear circuitry of the brain became less reactive as this positive approach and hope circuitry of the brain became more activated. And again, this was only when the women were focused on providing the physical support. When they were squeezing that stress ball and trying to relieve their own distress, there actually was no benefit whatsoever, either to how they felt or to what was going on in their brains. I think this is a really neat study, other than unless you're the person who's getting the electrical shocks. But it's a really neat study because it gives us a sort of a very thin slice of the way that we often relate to stress in our own lives, that we can either sort of focus on ourselves and how can I make myself feel better now? How can I suppress this stress, channel this stress, vent this stress? Or we can take a step outside of ourselves and look at who else might be struggling or suffering, and is there anything that we can do to bear witness to that or help? And when these women made that choice, because the experimenters told them to, it created this chemistry of hope and courage. And one of the things that we know from the science of training in a tend-and-befriend mindset is that the exercise that Monica led you in at the beginning of this talk has actually been shown to do the same thing as being able to physically hold and provide comfort or support to someone who is suffering. And this research comes out of the laboratory of Tanya Singer, who studies training empathy and training compassion. And in 2 different studies, they found that if you teach people the very meditation that you practiced just a few moments ago, you teach people that technique just one day and ask them to practice it for a few minutes every day. Then you bring them back into the laboratory and you have them watch news clips of people who are going through terrible situations. This particular news clip, this couple's child had recently died. He actually shot himself with the father's gun. And they're in this laboratory watching videos of people who are struggling and suffering, and there's nothing they can do. We've all had that experience of watching the news or hearing stories from loved ones of people who are suffering, and there's nothing we can do. And in this case, the people who had trained in the meditation that you just did, they actually had a very different emotional and neurological experience of being in the presence of people sharing their experience of suffering. They experienced more positive emotion. There was more a sense of connection and hope, even as they were witnessing the suffering. It didn't make their negative emotions go away. They still felt distressed to be aware of another person's suffering, but it was counterbalanced by this feeling of love and connection and hope. And their brains reflected that difference, and you saw an increase in activation in the brain's reward system again, while they were watching people talk about suffering. Rather than that fear circuitry going on, it was balanced by this circuitry of hope. And what's so interesting about these studies, by the way, is that the people were not doing the meditation while they were watching people talk about their suffering. They simply practiced that as a mindset for a few minutes a day. And when they were confronted with suffering they couldn't do anything about, they were able to stay connected to that feeling of care and connection and stay connected to a sense of hope rather than a sense of overwhelm or despair. This quote is from a researcher who studies the effect of caregiving, such as caring for a spouse or a child or a pet or a plant. And Stephanie Brown has come up with this really interesting idea that it actually revolutionized the way that I think about stress management or stress, how to best handle stress in our own lives. And she's pointed out that when you activate this caregiving system by caring for a child, a partner, a pet, a plant, that it transforms the nature of your own stress response, no matter what the source of the stress is. So I could be worried about work, but I go home and take care of my cat, and that interaction, when I'm connected, is going to transform the nature of my stress response about work. That by choosing to shift into a caregiving mindset and mode, that we actually can transform our experience of stress so that when we're overwhelmed about anything in our lives, when we're feeling anxious, when we feel paralyzed by stress, that shifting ourselves intentionally into the caregiving system transforms our own experience of stress so that we feel more hopeful about other things in life too. And that can lead to some really kind of funny study findings. So this is a series of experiments that were done at Wharton with adults across the age span. And in these experiments, the researchers were interested in finding out the different psychological effects of either being told you need to spend time helping someone else, or I'm giving you time back. You thought you were going to have to do this one thing. I'm giving you time back. Do something for yourself. Right? So what's the psychological consequence of being forced to spend time helping someone else or being given time back? And the outcome they were interested in was something called time scarcity or time abundance, which is a very common feeling of stress a lot of people have that says basically there's too much to do and there's not enough time to do it. Do you know that feeling? Yeah. Well, good, now I've got a solution for you. So across a number of experiments, they actually found that people who were forced to spend time helping someone else out in a way they had not planned to ended up experiencing an increase in time affluence. So what you're looking at here, these are folks who spent 10 minutes helping someone else. These are folks who spent half an hour helping someone else. So they actually lost time in the day. But they ended up feeling like they had more time, that time was not this limited resource in their life, compared to people who were given time to spend on themselves. And spending more time on yourself led to an even smaller sense of time affluence than spending less time on yourself. And what the researchers found is that this increased sense of time affluence seemed to come about because when people help others, they feel more efficacious and more hopeful about life. And the people in these studies who were asked to help someone else, afterwards their mood changed. And it wasn't just sort of a general, like, I feel good, but it was an increase in the sense that I can handle the challenges in my own life. Helping someone else made people feel like they had more personal resources. They felt better equipped to handle their own challenges. And that, in turn, changed their whole perception of something as objective as time. That feeling of like, I can't get it all done, there's just too much, I'm so overwhelmed. Spending time helping someone else helped relieve that particular form of stress by giving people a sense more of hopefulness and of strength. And so we know that even when people aren't naturally inclined to help others, when you nudge them in that direction, you can actually create not just that momentary feeling of increased confidence, less threat or overwhelm, but you can perhaps do that in a longer lasting way. So this particular study that was done in British Columbia, they took 10th graders who were not involved in any volunteer work and randomly assigned some of them to become volunteers. And the volunteer was actually quite lovely. They went to younger kids in their school district. They helped them after school, some with homework, some with sports, some with arts. I think there were some cooking lessons that happened. And they were basically helping out younger versions of themselves. And this was an urban setting. The kids were under a lot of stress, both, of course, the usual teen academic stress, but also structural stress in terms of economic challenges and other neighborhood challenges. And the researchers were interested in looking at how the experience of helping these kids changed the way that people felt about themselves. And they found that this experience boosted their self-esteem and also tended to boost their sense of themselves as somebody who enjoys helping others. They started to see themselves as someone who actually has more empathy for others and a stronger desire to help others. And interestingly, that latter change, the change in the sense of wanting to help others, the increased sense of empathy, was also associated with a change in their stress physiology. So they looked before and after the teens started volunteering at blood levels of chemical markers of inflammation that are typically considered to be markers for the kind of toxic stress that puts you at risk for depression or burnout or illness. It tends to go along with the psychological state of feeling really overwhelmed and constantly threatened or unsafe. What they found is that in this study, these highly stressed kids who lived in an urban area, after volunteering, they ended up having less of that physiological profile. They had less C-reactive protein, lower levels of interleukin-6, these markers of inflammation, which suggests that somehow helping these younger kids was transforming their own chronic stress physiology away from a physiology that is both toxic and contributes to the sense of being overwhelmed and threatened. And again, interestingly, the more that kids increase their sense of empathy for others and desire to help, the bigger these physiological changes. And the boost in self-esteem was not linked to these changes. Right? Even though it's great it boosted their self-esteem, but the physiological benefit came from the mindset shift towards this kind of tend-and-befriend approach to life. And we see this in lots of studies, that having a sort of tend-and-befriend approach to life seems to protect against the typical negative health consequences of stress. So this study that you're looking at here followed a little over 1,000 adults for 3 years. In the beginning of the study, they asked these adults, how many really difficult life experiences have you had this year? Things like getting a divorce or losing your job, having a loved one with a new health problem. So not like a bad hair day, but like these are really new difficult problems in your life. And they also asked people how much time they spent in what they called charitable giving. But they weren't measuring how much money people were donating. They were measuring things like, do you give blood? Do you volunteer at the local school? Are you involved at your church? Do you serve on any kind of board in your community? Are you giving back to your community in some way? And they followed folks for a few years to see how many new health problems they would develop that could be attributed to the stress in their lives. And what they found was that among people, let's see if I can help you guys out with this. So among people who did not contribute much to their community, right? So they weren't donating blood or donating time or serving in any way. People who had more negative life events ended up having more health problems than people who had fewer negative life events. So there was this increased positive relationship between stress and new health problems. And these were real health problems too. It wasn't how many colds did you catch, but things like chronic back pain or heart disease or a new diagnosis of diabetes or cancer. Okay, so if you are somebody who doesn't give back to your community, having more negative life events increases your risk of developing more health problems. But check out this flat line here, which pretty much can't get any flatter. And that is, those are the folks who are regularly engaged in giving back to their communities. And for them, there was no increased risk of having stressful life events. Notice, by the way, be totally transparent here, it's not like none of them developed any health problems. They're still humans, life is still happening, but having stress in your life has no increased risk. That somehow giving back to your communities made people completely protected and resilient from the expected harmful effects of stress on their health. And you can see the same thing when you look at mortality risk and stress. So in this particular study that was done by the same research group at the University of Buffalo, followed just under 1,000 adults, this time for 5 years. Again, a nice wide age range here. And in this study, they asked at the beginning again about the negative life events that have happened to you in the past year. And this time they asked not about giving to your community, but caregiving. How much time do you spend taking care of friends or family or community members outside of your immediate home? Not how much time do you spend with your own baby at home, but how much time do you spend caring for people just outside your immediate home? And what they found was that, and they followed people to see who died, right? That's an important piece of information. And they followed people over these 5 years to find out if having more stress in your life increased the risk of death. And what they found was that for people who did not spend much time caring for others outside of their immediate household, every negative life event increased their risk of death by 30%. And that's the kind of thing we're used to hearing, right? That stress will kill you. But among the people who crossed almost like a basic threshold, these were not people who were spending 80 hours a week caring for loved ones and friends outside their family. Once you basically crossed over into being somebody who does spend some time caring for others outside of your home, that increased risk went to completely zero. And once again, it's so interesting that what you see in these studies is that for people who have a tend-and-befriend orientation to life, they give back, they care for others, there is no increased health risk for the types of life events we usually associate with increased risk of illness or death. There's something about this tend-and-befriend mindset that seems to create physical resilience. And one of the things that has really struck me as I look at this research on the tend-and-befriend instinct is that it seems like the people who experience it the strongest are the ones who have suffered the most. That when you look into the population and you see who is it who's caring for others, who is volunteering, who feels the most natural empathy and compassion for others, it's often the people who have had the most suffering in their own lives. And psychologists call this altruism born of suffering. And this is an incredibly robust finding, that it seems like our own contact with suffering tends to awaken the tend-and-befriend instinct. I wanted to share with you just a couple of sort of the data points that support this, although I'm actually guessing probably many of you have had this direct experience yourself. My guess is if we took a poll of a bunch of people who are in a talk sponsored by the Center for Compassion and Altruism, that probably many of you also have an experience of suffering. And in this study that was done at the University of Minnesota, so this was a study with young adults, and they asked college students, who are of course very busy, they asked them how much time they had spent in the past 2 weeks helping friends or family. There's just basic helping behaviors. And they also asked them how much time they had spent volunteering in the past year, right? The sort of things that we talked about in the last two studies, these behaviors that seem to create resilience. And they also asked them how many major traumatic or negative life events they'd experienced in their lifetime. Things like being the victim of crime, rape, or assault. Things like experiencing the death of a parent, being in a life-threatening car accident, ever being homeless, and all the sorts of things that we would usually put under the label of suffering and experiences I would rather opt out of. And they looked at whether that lifetime trauma correlated with their helping behaviors and their volunteering. And the people who had experienced the most traumatic events in their life were spending more time helping loved ones and friends. They also spent more time volunteering. But what was interesting about this study is it was a longitudinal study. And so they followed people, and they waited to see who experienced new traumatic events. Because some of these kids got in car accidents. Some of them lost family members. Some of them became the victims of crime or rape. And the researchers looked at how experiencing that trauma influenced their later helping behaviors and volunteering. What they found is that, across the board, when people experienced a new traumatic event, they increased the amount of time they spent helping and caring for others, and they became more likely to volunteer, whether at school, with a church organization, or elsewhere in the community. And perhaps most importantly, the more time people spent volunteering or helping others after a trauma, the more they found meaning and purpose in their life, and the less likely they were to suffer from depression. They were coping better with the trauma to the degree that they were actually investing more in caring for others. Another study, moving to the other end of the lifespan, was a survey of 1,000 adults from midlife to later in life. And this study was interested in finding out what's a really good predictor of whether or not people are compassionate. And you can see here some of the items that were used to measure compassion. Think about whether you would agree with these. When I hear about someone going through a difficult time, I feel a great deal of compassion, even people I don't know. And one of the activities that provides the most meaning to my life is helping others in the world when they need help. And what they found is that looking at different variables, one of the best ways to predict people's scores on this compassion scale was how many negative life events and traumatic events they'd experienced in the past year. That having the recent experience of suffering seemed to activate this side of themselves. And it was not, in this particular study, they weren't looking at lifetime adversity. They were just looking at in the past year. And that there was something about having gone through something difficult recently that made people more likely to choose or find themselves being this version of themselves, the version that feels more compassion for others, and the version that takes meaning out of helping others. You're going to feel sorry for this guy in a second. So when I started to take a look at that research and the research on altruism born of suffering, I started to really think about why we have a tend-and-befriend instinct. You know, when you talk to researchers like Shelley Taylor and other people who have really introduced this idea to the world, often what they emphasize is how the tend-and-befriend instinct is a species preservation instinct, that I have it so that you all will survive if there's an emergency, that my having the tend-and-befriend instinct is mostly for you. And it's great that I have it so that I'm a resource for you when you're suffering. And likewise, that your instinct is there for me so that I am likely to be benefited by your awakened compassion and care. But when I look at this research on altruism born of suffering, I really start to think about how incredibly important this instinct is for our own survival. And it made me think about one of the other instincts that is sort of the opposite of a survival instinct that you see in all social species, including humans. And it's called the defeat response. And the defeat response, to really understand what it is, I'm going to start by telling you how it is. They create it in the laboratory. So researchers who are interested in trauma and stress will often try to create a defeat response in laboratory animals, particularly mice and rats, by doing this sort of thing to them. So one thing that they will do is hang a rat by its tail so that the only thing it can do to escape is kind of flail around, but it's got nowhere to reach and nothing it can do. And you just wait until it goes limp and gives up. Then you throw it in a bucket of water where there's nowhere for it to escape. It can be like crawling at the sides of the bucket, and it's swimming and it's swimming and it's treading water, and you wait until it gives up and starts to drown. And I think one of the most poignant examples of how to create a defeat response in the lab, I was at a talk last summer by a scientist who studies stress in animals, and this is his method. So he takes mice that are specifically bred to be smaller and weaker than the typical mouse, puts them in a cage with a mouse who is specifically bred to be bigger and more aggressive than the typical mouse, and basically allows the bigger mouse to beat the crap out of the little mouse. Then, before the mouse is dead, take the bigger mouse out of the cage, but house it in a cage where the little mouse can see it and smell it. And then once a day, take the big mouse out again, put it in the cage with the little mouse, a little daily dose of bullying and your beatdown, and then put it back in the cage where the little mouse can see it and smell it. And this goes on for weeks. Okay, so this is how you instill a defeat response in an animal. And a defeat response is basically a hardwired instinct to give up and stop using resources when there is nothing that you can do and nobody in your community who cares about you. And of course, humans have this response too. And as a biological instinct, it leads to a loss of appetite so that you start to maybe starve. It leads to social isolation. You no longer want to be with friends or family anymore. And you can't believe that anything that you do could ever make any difference. And you don't believe that there's anyone in the world who cares. And that defeat response is probably the best predictor of both things like suicide and also things like the bombing at the Boston Marathon, that sort of desperate attempt to do anything that matters, right? And so the defeat response as a human instinct or as an animal instinct is actually probably one of the worst experiences that we can have and adds incredible harm and suffering to society. And I began to think that the tend-and-befriend instinct may be sort of the best resource that we have for trying to avoid a defeat response in ourselves and also help prevent a defeat response in others who are facing great difficulties in their lives or who feel isolated and alone in their suffering. And when you look at the literature, what you see is that actually for people who are in a situation that could give rise to a defeat response, that being able to help someone else is a life raft. And so I normally don't do this kind of text on slides, but I kind of wanted to beat you over the head with this. So people who volunteer after a tragedy feel more optimistic and energized and less anxious, angry, and overwhelmed. Sort of think about how you felt after whatever most recent natural disaster, terrorist attack, war, atrocity that you heard about. And even when we're not the ones directly affected, if we find a way to contribute or volunteer, we're less likely to have that kind of defeat response or despair. People who actually survive a natural disaster are less likely to develop post-traumatic stress disorder if they are able to help someone else out in the disaster, either immediately or soon after the disaster. Among people who are living with chronic pain, which can very easily lead to a defeat response. The pain is never going to go away. It's only going to get worse. My life is going to always be characterized by pain. People who become a peer counselor for other people in pain end up actually experiencing a reduction in physical pain and disability. They're less depressed, and they have an increased sense of purpose in life. After the loss of a spouse, research shows that being able to care for anyone else helps relieve the depression that sets in after such a loss. Research also shows that people who are victims of a terrorist attack or other natural disasters are less likely to feel survivor guilt and more likely to find meaning in their life if they find a way to become a volunteer to help others. And then finally, as an example, after a heart attack, people who volunteer are less likely to experience depression. They have a greater sense of hope and a greater sense of purpose. Again, you think about any one of these as sort of turning points in life that could lead one to a defeat response or despair, and that being able to help others or being able to care for others is this life raft that helps balance our own suffering with some sense of purpose or hope. And this has gotten me thinking also about the best way to help others who are clearly struggling. And I know many of you are interested in this as well. You work in situations and communities where people are obviously suffering. And in many cases, the experience of being a recipient of those services or of that help is to experience yourself as somebody who doesn't have anything to offer, right? That I am the one being given resources, I am the one who needs help. And in some ways, that can actually reinforce this defeat response by lowering the sense of efficacy, of meaning, or of contribution. And I've gotten very interested lately in programs and organizations that actually use connection and service as a way to pull people out of situations that might trigger despair or defeat. So I'm going to share with you a few of my favorite organizations. These are just a few. We could stay for 8 hours if you want to hear about more. But one example is local here in Alameda County. This is EMS Corps. And this is an organization that trains at-risk young men who come from disadvantaged communities and trains them to become emergency medical technicians. And they don't just learn how to go around in an ambulance and respond to emergencies, but they become really important contributors to their own community. So they do things like give free blood pressure screenings and advice about cardiovascular health. They go door to door and make home visits to give health advice and check in on people who might not be going to see a doctor. And they even give free car seat checks. So they'll hang out in parking lots in these neighborhoods and help make sure that parents have car seats that are safe for their kids. And this is such an interesting intervention because the men who are in this program, they come from a community where 60% of men drop out of high school without graduating, huge crime rates. Many will go on to develop gang affiliations or become involved in drug crime. And the men who get involved in this program, rather than being unemployed, dropping out of school, actually from the most recent graduate class, 70% are employed. I think 75% are employed in the healthcare industry. And it's actually changing the way that they see themselves because they have the experience of being perceived in their community as the threat, right? They are the ones dragging down the community. They're used to having people be afraid of them when they walk down the street or being told all the ways that they are bringing harm to the neighborhood. And instead now they completely change the story about themselves. This is a quote from one of the young men who says, "I learned who I really am and who I could be." So they're changing people's personal identities as someone who is viewed in their own community as a threat, as the problem, and they are changing that identity that they are a resource to their own community and taking pride in that. This next organization works with service members returning from war and helps connect people who are struggling with post-traumatic stress disorder and have them train service dogs for other service members. And as part of this process, they get these dogs, they get to take care of the dogs, and they also have to teach the dogs how to respond in difficult circumstances that the person that they are given to might end up having a kind of triggered response to, like, say, the sound of a car backfiring that might sound like a gunshot or an explosion. So these service members need to train the dog how to stay calm and how to reach out to whoever is going to become the new owner or caregiver, companion for that animal. And so by stepping outside of their own reaction to being triggered in that moment, they have to turn their attention to this animal and make sure that this animal can stay calm, and that animal will then turn and give its affection and its care back to the person who might be experiencing threat. And what a sort of different radical way that is to work with PTSD, that it's very similar to that squeezing the ball versus holding the hand study, that you take someone who's so used to trying to manage their own reactions to triggers. How do I calm down? How do I make this memory go away? How do I control this emotion? And instead their attention is turned to this dog that they're caring for and that they're turning into a resource to help another service member. And the people who go through this program have reported a decrease in depression, a decrease in intrusive memories, and they are engaging in less self-medicine. So they are less likely to be relying on alcohol or other drugs of abuse to try not to feel their own emotions or memories. And they also report feeling a greater sense of purpose and a better sense of connection and belonging as they return home. And again, this is an example of basically taking people who have been in one situation primed to have not a tend-and-befriend instinct, bringing them back home and really help nurturing this tend-and-befriend instinct in a way that is of service to others. And then the last organization I'll tell you about, this is the Hope After Project. And the Hope After Project was founded by Jennifer White, you can see here. She was 23 years old when her mother died by suicide. And she had a really hard time coping with that loss. And she tried to do everything to deal with the loss. She did therapy, she did grief support groups. And about 2 years after her mother's death, she saw this notice that was asking for people to volunteer to repaint an elementary school. And something clicked for Jennifer, because she remembered the story that the way her mother had met her father was they were both working at a hospital. Her mom was a nurse and her dad was a doctor. And her mom had volunteered to paint Sesame Street characters on the wall of the pediatric ward. And that's how they met. And so Jennifer had this kind of emotional connection and thought, okay, I'm going to volunteer to help paint this school. And as she engaged in that service project, she said it was the first time that she felt a sense of hope after her mother's death, because she had a way to connect to her mother that was about her mother's life rather than her mother's death. And so she actually started this organization, the Hope After Project, that actually takes people who are grieving and helps them organize service projects that specifically honor the person that they lost. And she helps organize everything. She does the fundraising so that people just have the experience of showing up and celebrating the person that they lost by doing something for others that that person would have really appreciated. And so some examples of that are they've planted community gardens and trees, made care packages for people serving in the military. This is one of my favorites. They went and played and cared for kittens at an animal rescue organization. And in this case, they helped create a youth center and got skateboards for a skate park to honor a young man who had loved skating. And again, in each case, these service projects are about celebrating the life of the person who is lost. And people who participate in this really report that sense of, for the first time, a feeling of moving forward, that hope that is able to balance out the grief that is also present. And so the last study that I want to share with you, right, this would not typically have been the end of my talk, but this study just came out this week. And I wanted to share it with you. So this was a study that interviewed about 150 late middle life adults in the Chicago area. And they did deep probing interviews, hours, to find out the story of people's lives. And they asked these late middle life adults to really tell the story of your life. Tell us the key moments. Tell us what matters to you. Tell us what the story is of your life. And what they found is that people who were most likely to be making a difference in the lives of others and people who were experiencing the most psychological well-being, they tended to have a very similar story that they told about their life. They tended to tell a story that was about their own contact with suffering that inspired them to do something to transform that suffering into something positive. And they called that a redemption story. That people who were doing good in the world and also experiencing their own personal well-being, these were people who had used the suffering in their own life, either their own direct suffering or being aware of a loved one suffering or another community suffering. They used that suffering as a catalyst to motivate them to do something of value in the world. And they strongly believed that it was possible to transform suffering into something good. That was the story of people's lives who were thriving at this age. And so when I read that study and I was thinking about this talk, I was thinking how appreciative I am for the Center for Compassion and Altruism, who is basically helping all of us make that the story of our lives. I see many of you in the room I know who are part of the organization, and every moment we have in contact with this organization is helping us strengthen that experience. And just by choosing to be here tonight, you're choosing that narrative that you are somebody who cares about suffering and you are someone who believes that it's possible to do something to transform that suffering into something positive. And so I wanted to leave you. We started with a practice from the Stanford Compassion Cultivation Training, and I wanted to leave you with my favorite practice from the Stanford Compassion Cultivation Training. And this is a really simple version of the practice. It's a practice of, transforming suffering. And here's what the practice is. The practice involves becoming aware of suffering, your own or somebody else's, and taking a moment to really feel it, see it, know it, witness it, and in that moment, connect to your own intention to transform suffering into something positive. That's the practice. Connecting to your own intention to transform suffering into something positive. And I think that, the great beauty of this practice is that when we make that choice, when we bring that intention to mind, we have this whole biological system that is ready to back us up. We have this instinct, we have the oxytocin ready to make us connect and make us brave. And one of the sort of most courageous things that we can do is actually to choose in the moment of suffering, when sometimes there's other instincts come up that make us want to back away or run out of the room or shut down or feel defeated, is that we can choose to remember this intention and to believe that we have the capacity to transform suffering into something better. So with that in mind, thank you for being here. And I think we're going to go to questions, jokes, and story time. Sort of whatever you have to offer. And what I also say is I'm happy to try to answer questions about the science as best I can, but also if you have questions about compassion cultivation and that side of CCARE, if you're not involved in that and you're interested, I'm also happy to answer any questions about that side of the organization. So there are microphones on either side. There's a stampede happening right now. You don't want to be the last one in line.
Well, I'm thinking about professional caregivers.
Yes.
And thinking about like nurses.
Yes.
And if I were to adopt nurses and say, help more, serve others more to release your stress, because we know it's a very taxing
Yes.
profession. How does that work? Because they're always caring.
Yes.
Do you have
Yes.
thoughts?
So this is, okay, so great question. I'm going to repeat just in case people didn't hear it. What about people whose profession is caring? Or maybe not even profession, those of us who find ourselves in caregiving roles that can be quite stressful in and of themselves. And so the question is, well, they're already caring all the time, and it's quite difficult. And we know that when you care for other people all the time, it can increase your risk of burnout or depression. It's sort of a paradox of caregiving. You actually see both outcomes. And so the way that I think about that, and this comes from both science and personal experience, is that the paradox of caregiving is, first of all, when you look at the data, people who are caring for others, even those who report being burned out, are also showing resilience at the same time. That actually you can't always predict whether or not people are being nourished, protected, and made resilient by caregiving by whether or not they also feel exhausted by it. And I think that's actually quite interesting, that often resilience and that sort of the resilience that comes from caregiving seems to go along with inner experiences that are quite difficult. And then the question is, okay, well, that's interesting, so I can be exhausted and yet still protected in some way. That's nice. But what do I do to feel less exhausted and burn out, too? And I think that one of the ways I think about it is to remember that the tend-and-befriend instinct is about not just reaching out to help others, but reaching out for help as well. And sometimes people who are in caregiving professions have really built up the muscle for that one side of the tend-and-befriend instinct and have kind of atrophied the muscle of reaching out for support themselves. And like that is part of the same instinct. And if we are only putting ourselves in the position where we're helping others, we don't really have the full package that supports us as well. And so often what's needed in those situations is strengthening the muscle of self-care and asking others for help. The last thing I'll say about caregiving is there's a lot of interesting research on compassion and mindset and caregiving, both among people who are professional caregivers like nurses and doctors or hospice workers, and also people who are caring for a loved one who has an illness or a disability. And there are two things that seem to increase the likelihood that the outcome of caregiving will be positive rather than negative. One is the degree of active caregiving, right? So it is always difficult to have a loved one who's suffering. That pretty much always increases the risk of your own suffering. But if you separate that from people like who don't have a loved one who's sick or ill, so if you're just looking at people who have the experience of that reality, that is reality, the ones who care more do better than the ones who care less, even though people often think that the opposite will be true. And the other side is that being able to connect to the sort of the uplifts of caring is very protective. That in the moment of caring, even if you weren't able to get your loved one to eat, or even if your child throws something at you and you don't feel like an effective caregiver, that in those moments, if you're able to remember basically that motivation that Monica had you access, that if you're able to have that, to understand sort of the broader context for your caregiving, that is very protective as well. And so for people who are in a caregiving situation that is stressful and depleting and draining, those are really the two main suggestions. Rather than back away or shut down or sort of dissociate, like do it but don't feel anything to try to just get through it, to strengthen the self-care and asking for help, to stay engaged, and also to connect to that motivation.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi. So if something happened that created thousands or tens of thousands of opportunities for the CCARE curriculum, and we didn't want to wait 30 years for enough teachers to be run through the program to actually cover them all, what can you do about it?
Okay, well, that's a tough one. You know what the great thing about compassion cultivation is? So we have this program at Stanford that we like because we created it and we love it. And it's wonderful to experience and teach. But there are a lot of people who are doing great work in compassion. There are other interventions. There are other books. There are communities of faith that talk about the same thing. So I feel like while we are getting our act together to propagate the world with CCT, I think that as people who are interested in compassion, we can create those opportunities ourselves. And there are a lot of other people who are doing this work too.
Meanwhile, how long do you think it'll take
for
you to get your act, for us to get our act together, quote unquote?
We have how many in the room are CCT teachers? Oh, look, front row, right? Of course, they're A+ students. Well, So a couple of years ago, they would have been like this, right? There were only a couple of us who were teaching, so we're on it.
So, but
Thank
I'm
you
actually
guys for being on
really
it.
asking about mass propagation, tens of thousands of
Yeah.
opportunities.
Well, I'm not psychic. But I really appreciate your enthusiasm.
But I actually, it's a challenge. Yeah, it can fit into some programs that I want to start.
Yeah, great, good, exactly. And we should all be starting our own compassion cultivation trainings in our own lives. Yes,
First off, thank you for coming to speak tonight.
you're welcome.
The question I've got is in regards to the perspective on research. I notice a lot of the research is framed of stress mitigation, stress intervention.
Yeah.
I'm kind of curious in regards to, well, we're framing the whole effect of compassion in terms of stress. Is there any shift or any queries into begin to looking at the effect of compassion in of itself, either outside the context of stress or in more varied contexts?
Yeah, this is a good question, and we at CCT have done some research looking at, for example, the effects of taking CCT, and we do see interesting effects. So for example, some of the research that was led by Philippe Golden here at Stanford looked at finding that training in empathy and compassion through CCT changed the way that people deal with their own emotions. So they were less likely to feel like they need to suppress emotions. They reported less anxiety and worry, a little bit greater happiness, less fear of receiving help from others, being the recipient of other people's compassion. So lots of little elements like that, and there are a number of studies like that, where they take people who are not suffering in any extreme way, although, I mean, in reality, we're all carrying our own suffering with us. But it wasn't a context where people were specifically chosen because of grief or trauma, and found that, when a general population strengthens this capacity for compassion and empathy, you see really interesting psychological and social changes, and that research is growing. I think that there's certainly more research right now on mindfulness than there is on compassion, and it's kind of exciting to watch. So 10 years ago, if I'd been giving this talk, I would have said, yeah, there's no research on the effects of compassion on basically anything. So maybe we'll meet again in 10 years and I'll have more data.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Good.
Thank you so much for coming. So when you've got somebody who is not open to the idea of being cared for,
Yes.
do you have a similar physiological effect that happens with the person who's trying to care? And I'm more talking specifically of an individual or a set of individuals, not like the projects where you plant a tree, because I can see where that would work. But can you talk about that? I know you sort of spoke about it a little bit there, first answer to the question, but can you speak a little more about how you handle those situations, or do you get the same effect?
Yeah, so I'm going to just try to reflect and make sure I understand this. The challenge of wanting to care for someone or help someone who doesn't want to be cared for or helped. Is that the question? Yeah, so it's actually, that's a really interesting kind of existential problem, because what do we mean by caring for someone and helping for someone, right? So often when we want to care or help for someone, we have an idea or an agenda about what would be helpful and how they should be and what we are going to do to support that process. And in many cases, what we find in reality is that the other person or the community or whatever it is doesn't want that particular type of help, doesn't want to be viewed as a victim or needing of help, or has a different idea about what would be most helpful. And so I feel like, certainly what we do in CCT is we talk about stepping back from the agenda and connecting to the intention. And that when you connect to the intention, one of the things it actually does is better help you attune to the other and to the environment. So sometimes stepping back from the reaching out part can make us better able to have a kind of accurate empathy, to be quiet or still long enough to find out what might be most helpful. Or sometimes it's just being able to deal with our own desire to help and feeling like it's not being received. That sometimes what was so difficult about that situation is feeling the shutdown of our own compassion when our compassion is met with resistance, and how easily that can turn to, well, there's something wrong with that person, or then fine, I'm giving up. And so I think that sort of would be where I would start, to go back to the intention and see where staying connected to the intention and then just paying attention might lead. And you might find that the other person becomes receptive, or that you get new information, or even that it's just better, it's easier to tolerate how really frustrating that can be to want to help and yet not have it received in the way that you intended.
Hi, Kelly. Thank you, and I'll try to hit you up with a fun one.
Oh, okay.
So,
My favorite song, no, just kidding. He said he was going to ask a fun question, so.
so my question is actually, is it possible for this phenomenon to become pathological? For example,
yes.
somebody who,
Yes.
maybe they've been getting a lot of hits from oxytocin, from being able to genuinely help people in a stressful situation, and so they say, well, maybe I can, maybe they don't say this, but they do this, they'll start to create stressful situations in the lives of people around them in order to be able to help.
No, you're laughing. This is a real disorder, though. Are you laughing because you think that that's you? Is that, it's like, oh, I have adopted too many stray cats. No, that's me. Go ahead.
Yeah, so my question was, have you seen this, or have you heard of the science or such behind this?
Yeah, I mean, so I don't know that I don't come across it too often in everyday life, but there is research on this. There's an interesting book that came out a few years ago. I think it was called Pathological Altruism. So you can look that up if you're interested. But what you often see is that it is true that sometimes people get addicted to the sense of hope and optimism and meaning that comes from helping others, and it can turn pathological. There's the example of parents who will poison their children so that they get to be in the caregiver role. Yes. It's not common, but it happens. There are hoarders of animals who get addicted to that hit of rescuing an animal, and when you see people in that hoarding situation, that's usually what's happening. And it's interesting that you raise it, because it's a problem, and there's a lot of suffering in that, but also it really illustrates the point about the biological research. When I was saying that helping others activates the reward system, it increases the chemistry of courage and hope, and it dampens fear and despair, it really does. And because of that, people can get addicted to it in the same way that people get addicted to other drugs or things that really activate the reward system. So because I don't have any direct experience with it, I also don't have any advice for it. I mean, there are people who treat that with therapy and medication, and I don't know anything about the process of reversing that kind of pathological altruism.
Maybe I'll check out that book.
Yeah, check it out.
Thanks.
I'd like to know how to make your work more legible, because you point to a lot of research, but most of society doesn't care and has no interest and doesn't see the relevance of rats to them. And I want to provide addicting bite-sized bits to people so that they're like, wow, altruism's great. I should totally have more of this in my life.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, maybe that sounds like a job for you. It sounds like maybe you have some skills in that area. That's like a good homework. You should tweet me later on. Give me the 140 characters. I mean, it's a great question, yeah. So the question is how do we make this more accessible? Because the sad truth is, yes, a large percentage of the population doesn't care about science. And I'm very grateful that most of you are still in the room. I think only 3 people left when the first science slide came out. Yeah, so I mean, I think that all I can say is I deeply encourage you to do it or others to do it. I think that actually it was something, where's Sarah? Are you still here? So you said something to me this morning. There's a song called, is it All the Good or All of the Good? And the lyrics are, I can't do all the good in the world, but I'm going to do all the good that I can. Is that right? But the world needs all the good I can do. So I can do some of the stuff with science. I think you might need to do some of the stuff with the bite size. And you all have your own assignment. The world needs all the good that you can do that I can't do. That seems like a really good note to end things on. I'm going to call a moratorium. Thank you, guys.